YouTube'u da başlatıyorum.
Başlat.
Hello.
Hello. Professor Seligman, we are still accepting people. So we are around 200 people now on YouTube and here. So we're just going to wait a little bit more and then start.
I'm always early for things. Is that your musical score or mine?
Our music.
Merhaba, bir şey soracaktım İbrahim Hocam.
Buyur.
Toplantı başlamadan önce de hani bir şeyler sorma şansımız var mı yoksa bekleyelim mi?
Bekleyelim biraz.
Tamamdır. Okay.
Kaç kişi oldu? Bence artık Tuna başlayalım.
Başlamadan önce bu arada soruları olanlar ya da soracak olanlar ellerini kaldırabilirlerse ya da
Ben onları söyleyeceğim.
sorular sormak isteyenler yazarlarsa aynı.
Okay. I guess we can go ahead and start as people are coming in.
Let's wait till
15?
11:15 as promised.
Yeah.
absolut inbegriffen.
Geçen haftalarda buradalardı. Ağzı oynasın diye getiriyorlardı. Rahatsız olmuşlar.
You taught me the courage of stars before you left. How life carries on endlessly, even after death. With shortness of breath, you
Hello everyone. We are almost 300. If Professor Seligman, it is okay, we can start. Before we start, I want to thank you, Professor Seligman, for kindly accepting our invitation. Firstly, I want to introduce my teammates briefly. I am Aleyna and my teammates are Tunahan, Ekin, Mahmut, Elif, Pelin, Melisa and Buket. And we want to say that we were very excited as the team to begin this adventure and organize such an event with a big name like you. There was around 1,000 applications for this event, so we want to thank you for first Professor Seligman and then all the participants. Before we start, I want to give brief information about Dr. Seligman. Dr. Seligman is director of the Penn Positive Psychology Center, the Zellerberg Family Professor of the Psychology in the Penn Department of Psychology, and director of the Penn Master of Applied Positive Psychology program, commonly known as the founder of the Positive Psychology. And Professor Seligman is a leading authority in the fields of positive psychology, resilience, learned helplessness, depression, optimism, and also pessimism. He is also a recognized authority on interventions that prevent depression and that build strength and well-being. He has written more than 250 scholarly publications and 20 books, including Flourish, Authentic Happiness, Learned Optimism, and his last book about autobiography, The Hope Circuit. And today we are going to spend a 90-minute question-answer season with Professor Seligman. Please feel free to ask your question. This program will be moderated by Dr. Ibrahim Macar. He is our not only beloved teacher and at the same time our moderator. I want to say thank you for always supporting us and helping us. Now I will turn the microphone to dear Dr. Ibrahim Macar to start the question answer season. Thank you very much for everyone.
Thank you, Aleyna, for the nice introduction. And I would like to start by thanking Dr. Seligman for kindly accepting our invitation and being here. So we are going to follow the nature of the book, basically. This is the book that we are going to mainly focus on today. And book covers all the things that Dr. Seligman has worked on and also his life. So if you have any questions, you can start typing in your question in the chat box. So we're going to follow kind of two part of question and answers. Some questions I will just ask directly from the chat box. But if you want to ask your question directly, you can raise your hand and then ask and speak the microphone when it's your turn. So let me start with the first kind of general question so we can kind of warm up and get ready for the whole session. Dr. Seligman, what was the main motivation behind writing this book?
Well, first, let me thank you for inviting me to meet all the students. This is a new format for me. My favorite activity in life is teaching and meeting students, and COVID changes all of that. So what I decided to do was, at least for the next few years, rather than traveling the world to meet students, is to hold meetings like this. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing your questions and meeting you, if not face to face. Well, just starting on the first question, when I reached age 75, it seemed to me that I should try to write an autobiography. And that's what the book, The Hope Circuit, is. I talk about the four main ideas that I've been involved in psychology for the last 50 years. And the theme of the book is that there was a uniform change in three different domains over the last 60 years. The first was in my life. So I went from being a depressed, pessimistic, anxious young person to being a much more optimistic, happier, forward-looking person. The second thing that happened was that my field changed. It went from being in the 1960s about misery, suffering, a conflict, to being more about meaning and love and purpose and what enables a good life. And indeed, I've been part of that movement. And the third thing that happened was that the world got better. So by every material standard we have in the world, this is a better world now than it was 60 years ago. Although interestingly, morale is not better. And many people don't realize that. So at any rate, the main theme of the book was to interweave the changes in my life, the changes in the field of psychology, and the changes in the world around.
Thank you for the answer. As you also
Tell me, am I speaking too rapidly?
No, I think it's great because we only have 90 minutes, so we would like to cover more things. So it's just fine. As you also stated in your book, and you started off your book with the learned helplessness. So if you can kind of briefly state how learned helplessness, came out as a topic in your work, and then how it kind of changed over time. If you can explain those things, that would be great.
One of the great things about being in a field for more than 50 years is you can find out you were wrong. And so the very first major thing that I was involved in was learned helplessness. And we basically found with animals and people that when they received bad events that were uncontrollable, that they became profoundly helpless and looked very much like clinical depression. And Steve Mayer and I postulated that what happened was that people and animals learned that nothing they did mattered. And that if you believe that nothing you do matters, you don't try. So that's what we believed and wrote about more than 50 years ago. And I went off and became a clinical personality social psychologist, and Steve Mayer, my close colleague, went off and became a neuroscientist. And what Steve wanted to do was to find out what was going on in the brain of rats when they became helpless. And unfortunately, until about the 1990s, the technology of looking at the brains of animals, to say nothing about the brains of humans, were terribly primitive. But starting in the late 1990s, you could actually begin to track in fine detail what was going on in the brain. And we found out we were wrong, that we were 180 degrees wrong. And basically what Steve did, I'll summarize it briefly here, was he looked at a structure called the dorsal raphe nucleus, which is kind of right up the nose into the limbic system. It's 50,000 cells in rats and 150,000 cells in human beings. And importantly, it's too small in human beings to be able to use any technology that we have to hit it directly. So we don't have the technology, but we do have the technology in rats. And Steve Mayer found out that the dorsal raphe nucleus is necessary and sufficient for producing learned helplessness. So when he stimulated it directly, he got helplessness. When he turned it off and gave animals inescapable shock, they weren't helpless. Then he looked at a certain set of tracts in the ventromedial forebrain and found that these tracts, which I now call the hope circuit, when stimulated, turned off the dorsal raphe nucleus and turned off learned helplessness, and that this circuit was necessary and sufficient for breaking up helplessness. And what Steve and I postulated from this was that the action in learned helplessness is not the helpless part, but the learning of mastery, the learning of hope, the learning that there's something you can control. So I believe human beings have a circuit, as do all mammals, that breaks up helplessness. And it's that circuit where the learning of mastery, the learning of hope, and the expectation that you will be able to control major events in the future resides. So that's a 5-minute summary of about 50 articles in neuroscience on learned helplessness.
Thank you so much for the answer. We can now have one question from the audience. I can see on the screen, Naz King. You can just turn on your microphone and ask your question.
Hi, and thank you for your speech, Mr. Seligman. It's a very great honor for me to speak with you. In a speech you gave when you were the president of APA, you said that psychology was half-baked. And do you still think that the field of psychology have a lot to do? And what do you think about the current state of the field of psychology?
Yes, so 20 years ago, I said that psychology was half-baked. And what I meant by that was that psychology worked with moderate success on what was wrong, on the mental illnesses, on victims, on depression, on panic, on schizophrenia, on divorce, on substance abuse. And indeed, I have spent the first 35 years of my career working on those things. But the premise, unspoken, was somehow if we got rid of all the things that were wrong, that we would have a good world and people would be happy. But as a clinical psychologist, when I occasionally did good work with my patients and I helped them to... Sorry. And I helped them to damp down all sadness, anxiety, anger, the negative emotions. I didn't come up with a happy patient. I came up with an empty patient. And that's because the skills of well-being, the skills of happiness are something over and above the skills of fighting depression, anxiety, and anger. So positive psychology was a movement that asked the question, what is well-being? How can we build well-being? How can we measure well-being? And what is the effect of building well-being on buffering against the usual mental illnesses?
Okay, thank you. As we just started getting into positive psychology now, there's another question here. I wonder the future directions in positive psychology. So what will happen next? And now, considering that the mindfulness and self-compassion areas became kind of overemphasized, how does and will positive psychology locate itself in the field and also everyday life of people?
Good, yes. So first on the future of positive psychology, hard to gaze into the future, but the areas in which I think the future will occur is first better science. So we need more science in human beings and in animals about PERMA, about well-being. So the first thing that we need is good science. The second thing, having found out a fair amount about measuring happiness and about building happiness, the question is really the dissemination of these findings. So if we think we know something about building well-being and we think we can measure it in individuals, in corporations, and in whole nations, The question is how to disseminate it. And for me, that takes place first in education. So one of the things I'm most interested in is moving the measurement and interventions of positive psychology into schools. And indeed, there are several hundred schools around the world. I don't know if there are in Turkey now that teach the skills of positive education to young people, both in very young people, in high school and in university. And I think that's the fulcrum in many ways. Second domain in which I think dissemination will occur is in corporations. So I think we know quite a lot about how to build well-being and how to build productivity and how to build worker life satisfaction in corporations. And again, there are hundreds of corporations around the world. I don't know if this is true in Turkey, that measure and teach positive psychology. And third and most important is politics. So much of politics in my own nation and in your nation as well has been a race to the bottom. It's been about what's wrong. But if you followed my answer to the first question, getting rid of things that are wrong doesn't necessarily lead you to what is right. It doesn't necessarily lead you to well-being. So I think we need a politics of well-being. And there are a couple of nations in the world doing that. Dubai is one, Ecuador is another, Australia and New Zealand. And these are all nations that say what good government is about is not money, but the building of well-being. So let's measure well-being in our citizens, and let's have interventions in education and in the workplace that build well-being. So that's the answer to the first part of the question. Education, schools, corporations, and a positive politics. And I was asked to comment on mindfulness and self-compassion. So mindfulness is one of the Buddhist techniques that's part of positive psychology. It's useful as an anti-anxiety technique. There are several different forms of meditations in Buddhism, but mindfulness is a useful anti-anxiety technique. Self-compassion, while many positive psychologists are enthusiastic about it, I'm not particularly. And let me tell you why. I think we often make mistakes in life, and we're responsible for them. And it's very important that we have guilt and shame, and that we understand when we have produced something that has negative effects on other people in the world. So a movement that says we should be very compassionate toward ourselves is very good about cutting shame and guilt. But shame and guilt are emotions that have evolved for very good reason, and very often to correct your behavior and to understand that you're responsible for many of the things that go wrong in your life. Very good question. Thank you.
Thank you for the answer. We can have another question from the audience. Hilal Baltacı. She has been waiting for quite a time.
Thank you. Hello, firstly, thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to meet you. I wanted to ask that, what kind of criticism did you encounter while you studying on your theory of learned helplessness? And I wanted to ask that, why you chose dogs? Thank you so much. So glad to meet you.
I'm sorry, Hillel, why did I choose what?
Dogs. Dogs.
Oh, well, they were there, and someone else had, it was the only, in 1964, I found myself as a graduate student in a laboratory that was doing Pavlovian conditioning in dogs. So as a 21-year-old graduate student, that was what was there. I very quickly, being a dog lover, moved to rats and then people. So that was part one. What was part one of your question, Hillel?
I asked that what kind of criticisms did you encounter while you're studying on your theory of learned helplessness, and which one was the most considerable criticism?
Well, back in the 1960s and 70s, the main criticism came from behaviorists. And they basically said that people and animals were stimulus response creatures. And they never learned that anything. And learned helplessness said that people and animals were cognitive and they could learn that their actions didn't matter. And so the much of the important work we did in the 1960s and 70s was to show indeed that animals and people learned the proposition that nothing I do matters. And when they learned that, they didn't try hard and they became passive and had trouble learning. The main criticism that I encountered later on in work on positive psychology and on optimism was a surprise to me. So when I started, Hillel, to work on happiness, I thought it would be like motherhood and that no one would criticize it. And immediately, critics jumped on it. Some of them very articulately, some of them reflexively, and basically said it's a bad idea to make people happy. Because if you make people happy, they will become indifferent to the troubles of the world. And we don't want bad citizens who are happy and blithe and indifferent to the troubles that we have all around the world. And that's an interesting criticism, and it turns out to be 180 degrees wrong. So there are about 20 studies of who are good citizens, who volunteer, who give money to good causes, who are people who go out and help victims around the world. And 19 of the 20 studies show that it's happy people who do that. So depressed people tend to turn inward. They don't volunteer, they don't give money, and they're more concerned with themselves, which is a natural defense when you're depressed, than happy people. So, Hillel, that's two of the many criticisms that I've encountered. The first one, that people were stimulus response creatures, was mostly wrong. The second one is very much misguided, and that is there's very good reason to teach people well-being, because they will then be better citizens.
Okay, thank you for the answer. As we kind of started talking about critics, about learned helplessness or positive psychology, and you also mentioned in your book that positive...
My wife has just bought me a muffin. Oh, thank you, darling. I haven't had breakfast yet.
Sure.
Thanks for doing
Do you
that,
want the
Mandy.
muffin or do you want
Oh, I'm fine, just a muffin.
those?
Mandy, do you want to say hello to 300 students from Turkey? Come and say hello.
Hi.
This is my wife, Mandy, who's a photographer who has a website on happy photographs.
Not yet, I don't.
Not yet, she said. So if you're a photographer, look up, Google Mandy Seligman, and you will find a website about happy photographs.
No, not yet, you won't.
Not yet. Do it next week.
No, 2 months. 2 months.
I'm sorry. So I missed the question.
And also really pleasure to meet your wife, because you dearly mentioned her in your book again and again. So it was nice to see her in person as well. So as we were kind of getting into criticisms about the positive psychology, and one of the criticisms that you also mentioned in your book, that positive psychology has been considered as kind of representing weird cultures, not other cultures, only Western educated cultures. Can you kind of expand on that? Why that's the criticism, and then how you would respond to that criticism?
Yeah. So positive psychology started with weird Western, male, well-educated people, but it very quickly expanded around the world. And so there is quite a lot of cross-cultural positive psychology. The country in which I'd say it's most popular in many ways is China. So there is a great deal of research in China in positive psychology and positive education. So I think, indeed, it was a good criticism initially of positive psychology, but now there are literally hundreds of articles about well-being and positive psychology all around the world. Just one example, in Africa, Uganda, Michael Freza has done work on perceptions of control among entrepreneurs and the effect of well-being, positive psychology, and success in Africa. In India, Stephen Leventhal has taught positive psychology to 50,000 untouchable girls with good results. And that's just two of many studies around the world. And indeed, there is an organization which I urge all of you to join. It's called IPA, the International Positive Psychology Association. There are several thousand members from all over the world. And there are positive psychology associations in at least 20 nations around the world. Ibrahim, does Turkey have a positive psychology association?
I'm not sure if anyone knows from the audience. They can answer.
Yes, there is actually.
Okay, so yeah,
It's not very active, but yeah.
Good, and if you can make contact with them, Ibrahim, and support it with all the people on this call, that would be good. But positive psychology is very international and very cross-cultural at the moment. Interestingly, I spend my morning answering email, and about 1 out of 3 emails I get comes from the Islamic world.
Oh, that's interesting. So another one was about the collective learned helplessness. So how would you consider collective learned helplessness? When you kind of take the cultures, we consider they are collectivistic. And then how would you consider that collective learned helplessness? Would it be possible, or at least what are your opinions about that?
Yes, that is actually what I'm working on right now. So let me try to explain my take on it. For the last couple of years, I've been writing a book which I call Agency. And I define agency as having 3 components. The first component is efficacy, what Bandura called self-efficacy, the belief that I can achieve a goal. The second component is optimism, that I believe I can achieve this goal in the future. And the third component of agency is imagination, the belief that there are many goals that I can achieve in the future. So what I've been trying to do is to trace and measure agency across history and across the world. And the basic thesis is that when people collectively believe in agency, believe in efficacy, they're optimistic, and they're imaginative, that's when human progress occurs. And when people collectively believe they don't have agency, either as individuals or as a collective, that's when stagnation occurs. And indeed, so I've been tracking as best I can over the course of history, Greco-Roman history, Chinese history, medieval Christianity, whether or not that's true. And I think we have quite a lot of evidence that when people as individuals believe they're helpless, believe they don't have agency, when they're part of a religion or a culture that believes that it's all up to God and not up to people, all up to fate and chance and not up to individuals, that's when you don't get human progress. That's stagnation. And when cultures begin to adopt beliefs in agency, that the balance of control, that humans have a great deal of it, that's when you get human progress. That's when you get technology and medicine and science and arts and literature and political freedom. So in very brief, I've been working on it for 2 years and it's 3 years away from completion. I think collective agency and individual agency is the key to human progress, both in the past and very importantly, in our future.
Okay, thank you. We can have another question from the audience. İlke Bayazıtlı.
Yeah. Thank you very much for joining us. You actually already mentioned my question. So I've read the 2 chapters on positive education on the website of the Positive Psychology Center. And there is certainly impressive examples of how positive psychology is implemented in schools in different countries. But there were not any examples from Turkey. And you probably know that Turkey is a very highly populated country and with relatively low income. And the curricula are mostly determined by the central government. So I would really love to hear your opinions about how positive psychology can be applied in so many schools with limited resources.
Yeah, yes. So first, there is an organization called IPEN, International Positive Education Network, which I recommend you're all joining. It's free. And there are curricula which have been used all around the world from age 5 all the way through university about teaching positive education. And there is measurement of positive education, whether or not the students increase in well-being and whether or not their academic performance increases as well. So many of the tools already exist. And these have been done in China, Australia, Great Britain, Europe, and the like. As far as I know, they have not been done in Turkey. They've been done in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, I believe. So the tools are already there. And very importantly, you don't need to be rich to do this. This has been done with untouchable girls in India, and it's been done at schools in Australia in which the kids have their own polo ponies. But it doesn't cost anything. The curriculum exists. It's been demonstrated effective. And it's not about rich or poor. Rather, it's about learning the techniques that build positive emotion, that build engagement, that build good relationships, that build meaning and accomplishment. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk to students in Turkey was everything is there for it to be done in Turkey. The measurements are there, the interventions are there, they need to be adaptive to Turkish culture, and there is good reason to believe that when you do these interventions with young people, it both increases well-being, increases PERMA, and it increases academic performance.
Okay, thank you. We have several questions regarding kind of clinical psychology and then
one more thing to say about that. I'm a fanatic answerer of email. So if you want to be put in touch with the people who have, for example, curricula for positive education, measurements for positive education, just email me. My email is Seligman at upenn.edu. And I'm very faithful about answering email.
Okay, next question comes from the clinical perspective, I guess. What would you suggest to a patient who is highly depressed and identifies him or herself with pessimism and perceives pessimism as an important feature of him or herself that help him or her become a perfectionist? In fact, that perfectionism and pessimism holds him back to move forward, and the fear of failure leads to more inactivity. How would you break this loop for someone who is resisting to new perspectives such as learned optimism, perhaps explaining how neuroplasticity works with that?
Well, that's a very good question. Now, it's got two parts. It's first, how do you deal with severe depression and pessimism? And the basic answer to that is there are two effective treatments for depression and pessimism, two effective psychological treatments. One is cognitive behavioral therapy, and the second is interpersonal therapy. What both of them do basically is they get you to recognize your most pessimistic thoughts and to dispute them realistically. And positive psychology endorses those two forms of therapy. It should also be mentioned before I get to the nub of this question, which is really, what if someone likes their pessimism? That the most recent book that I wrote with Tayyab Rashid, a former Pakistani postdoc of mine, is called Positive Psychotherapy. It's published by Oxford last year, and it's a manual of treatment for positive psychotherapy, particularly with depressed people. And positive psychotherapy, as best we can tell, probably works about as well as cognitive behavioral therapy. So that outlines 14 sessions of interventions for psychotherapy from a positive point of view. Now, the most challenging part of this very good question is, what if someone really likes their pessimism? What if they believe in it? What if they say the world is a terrible place and I'm right? And why should I change it? And the answer here is that you're entitled to your pessimism, but you should know the sequela of pessimism, which are well documented. First, if you're a pessimist, if you believe the world is a terrible place and you can't do anything about it, you're between 2 and 8 times as vulnerable to depression as optimistic or neutral people. Secondly, if you're a pessimist, the chances are that when you're challenged in the workplace and in school, you do worse and you give up more readily. Third, when you become physically ill, pessimists do worse. And the mortality rate among pessimists, about between 6 and 8 years of life between pessimists and optimists, with optimists living 6 to 8 years longer than pessimists. And that is with good studies that hold constant physical risk factors. So pessimism, you're entitled to it. You can believe whatever you want about the world, but you're going to get more depressed. You're not going to do as well in school and in work. You're going to have a shorter life, and physical illnesses are going to be worse. Make your choices.
Okay, thank you. on a related note, in your book, you mentioned the word cloud of low neuroticism emotional stability group consists of many physical health sport words. For example, workout, basketball, soccer. What are your thoughts on this possible relationship, especially when we consider people who are very active and addictive to social media do also report higher depression and anxiety, unlike people less engaged in social media?
First, let me flesh out the study that Ibrahim was talking about. So, one of the things that we've been doing lately is to use big data to measure the well-being of the world. And the way we do that is a huge advance over giving questionnaires to people. It too has artifacts. But here's what we do. PERMA, well-being, happiness, has a lexicon. So in English, there are about 50,000 words and phrases which correlate with happiness and well-being, or with its opposite, anti-PERMA. So what we do these days is we comb through the social media, Twitter, Facebook statuses, and we measure the amount of PERMA and anti-PERMA words. Okay? So as a methodology, we can ask the question for a corporation, a province, a state, and a whole nation, what is the level of PERMA? And then we can ask, given different levels of PERMA as measured in social media, what is physical health like in that domain? So led by Johannes Eichstädt in the last few years, we took 170 million tweets and we measured, quantified well-being in the 1,300 largest counties in the United States. And we measured mortality in those counties as given by the Center for Disease Control. In particular, we were most interested in mortality from cardiovascular disease, which is one of the specialties that I work on. And what we found was that counties which had high well-being words, high PERMA words, as measured by big data, had significantly lower rates of cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular death than counties that were high in anti-PERMA words. So counties that said happy, folks, thank you, God, blessings, conferences, basketball, were low in cardiovascular disease. Counties that said dull, shit, boring, whore, were very high in cardiovascular disease. Now, importantly, this brings us to the question of social media. Interestingly, it was the young people, the people your age, who were tweeting, and the people my age in those counties who were dying. So that basically shows that the atmosphere in a county, as measured by what young people tweet about, is contagious and relates to the physical health of older people. Now, embedded in the question was, what is the relationship between the use of social media and depression and pessimism and the like? Well, there is a growing literature which is ambiguous about the social media. And if you had to make an average across the 50 studies of use of social media and depression, on average, the more you use the social media, the more depressive and anxious you tend to be. It's not a big effect, but it's there. But the social media aren't going away. I mean, we're on the media right now. And the important thing is, given they're not going to go away, is to use them in much more pro-social, constructive, anti-depressing ways.
Okay, thank you for the answer. Now we can have a question from Jamila.
Hello, Mr. Seligman and everyone else. It's such a great pleasure. I can't even express my gratitude enough for being able to ask questions to you today. My question is something that I've been wondering about from since my first introductory psychology course, actually. We talk about different views on the nature of humanity and of humans, ranging from the psychodynamic perspective, viewing humans as a rather negative, and the humanistic perspective, focusing on the more positive in the humans. And with your teachings on learned helplessness that was later changed to learned optimism, I was wondering if we say, well, this is obviously a little of my interpretation as well, but if we say that what is natural is actually the helpless reaction that we give, and what is learned is rather the optimism and the ability to cope with the problems that life throws at us, what can we say about the nature of humanity from this perspective? Can we say that our nature is the more vulnerable and that we're using well-being as a preventative tool to deal with our vulnerability for mental diseases, or could we talk about different nature for humans viewing it from this perspective?
That's a very insightful question, Jamila. So I do have a view of of human nature and the nature of humanity, and that is that we are highly adaptive, nimble creatures, and it's the reason we're the dominant species on Earth. We adapt ourselves to malevolent environments, to difficult environments, and we adapt ourselves to benign, positive environments as well. Now, interestingly, Freud and Schopenhauer basically told us that the best we could ever do in life was not to suffer and not to be miserable. And down at the core, what we were was negative, evil creatures. And indeed, many aspects of religion have said the same thing, that down at the bottom, what we are is sinful, negative creatures. Well, there's a lot to be said for that. But I think that's only half the story, that when we find ourselves in environments that are miserable, in which people are out to get us, in which there's very little human freedom, in which the environment is terrible, that we adapt to that. And having a rotten to the core view and being vigilant for what's wrong in the world is highly adaptive. And Freud, Schopenhauer, and religions of sin and redemption are adaptive in such worlds. But humanity, Homo sapiens, has often found itself at peace in good worlds that we want to take advantage of. And so we have the machinery for being positive, for having meaning, for being optimistic, for being cooperative, for being idealistic. And we're able to adapt ourselves to that kind of world. So very importantly, it's not that human beings are rotten to the core. They're rotten to the core in rotten environments very often. But human beings in benign environments are good, cooperative, altruistic, and kind. And that's part of our nature. And so it's my view of human nature is that we adapt to our environment. Now, very importantly, the world today, Turkey, the United States, and almost the entire world as a whole, is in a materially much more benign environment than, these are two of my 3 dogs, I don't know if you can see them, than we've ever been before. So for me, the aspect of human nature that holds the most hope for the future, no. is a not a rotten to the core view of humanity, but a view that says that human beings are capable of cooperation, altruism, selflessness, and meaning. So that, Jamelia, is essentially my view of human nature, that it's nimble, it's adaptive, and it comes from evolution. Evolution essentially has two aspects that are important. One is survival, which is often a zero-sum game, but reproduction, sex, differential reproductive edge are positive-sum games in which we build. And so for me, the survival part has its roots in negative emotion, and the reproductive edge has its roots in cooperation and positive psychology and building something that wasn't there before.
Thank you so much, Mr. Seligman. Thank you.
Thank you. Tarek, you can ask your question now.
Hello, Mr. Seligman. I am so excited to ask you any question about this. I listened the last speak from APA and I love it. Thank you for this also. I am a student in Turkey, but in my perspective, we have a lot of problem for an education, and also in the world they are arguing the academic is good or bad enough to teach something or educate the people. I ask you about this. What will you do to students now for this time in social media, in lots of opportunities to learn lots of stuff? What would you do in this time you were a student?
Yes, so my view is the teaching of agency. So when students are agentic, when they believe that they matter, that they can do things to change the world, this is what positive psychology says is the universal that should be taught. So there are techniques for measuring efficacy and building it, the belief that I can accomplish my goals. There are techniques for building optimism, the belief that I can realistically do this again in the future. And I hope there is the building of techniques that increase imagination, the belief that I can be efficacious across many goals. So, Tariq, while that doesn't give you specifics of what to teach, I think the way I would sum it up is we can teach hope. When people have hope, they change the world. When they don't have hope, when they believe they're not efficacious, when they're pessimistic, and when they're unimaginative, they stagnate.
Okay, Umay, you may ask your question.
Thank you for the opportunity. I wonder something. As a psychologist, you created a theory which is very powerful, and it became the base of a new job, which is coaching. And I wonder, how do you feel about it? How useful the field of coaching is in contributing to well-being and positive psychology in general?
Yeah, I'm all for coaching. I think it's a great new profession. It complements clinical psychology. So clinical psychology, of which I am one, is about trying to neutralize or minimize the mental disorders. Coaching for me, at its best, is about the building of well-being. So for me, coaching first has the scope of practice for coaching is the building of PERMA. Empirically, there are measures of whether or not you're building PERMA when you're coaching. And by the way, those of you who do this, all these measures are free. I have a website that's free that at least 5 million people have registered at. It has all the leading tests and measures of well-being. I don't know how many of these are translated into Turkish, but there are some in Arabic and across other languages as well. But in coaching, you can measure whether or not you're increasing PERMA. And there are a set of interventions for coaches that build PERMA. So I'm very supportive of coaching. I want to make it scientifically responsible. And to do that, I think we need to say what the scope of practice is, which is the building of well-being. We need to make it empirical, and that is to use interventions that actually work and have been demonstrated to be better than placebos. And most importantly, you need to measure your outcomes. You need to find out if they actually work.
Thank you. Turaj.
Hello, thank you for us today. It's a very pleasure to ask you a question directly. Positive psychology generally has a difficulty in quantification of data. Like mostly the work is done is qualitatively. What do you think about the future aspects of big data on quantification? Actually, you gave some examples to my question, but I want your direct opinion about it.
Yeah, I'm not a great fan of qualitative work. I think qualitative work is the beginning that then leads you to quantitative replicable science. So almost everything I do is quantitative. And let me say something about the quantitative nature of psychology. So measurement, so 30 years ago, we had measures of depression and anxiety, but we had no good quantitative measures of happiness or meaning or engagement or good relationships. But over the last 30 years, psychometricians have developed sophisticated questionnaire ways of measuring PERMA, of measuring well-being. And so up to about 5 years ago, that's what I would have said about the quantitative nature of psychology. Good psychology is scientific and quantitative, but there's been a major quantitative change in psychology. So one of the problems about questionnaire research is that if I ask you, Tariq, how happy are you right now on a 1 to 10 scale, and you tell me 8, I don't know if you're lying, if you're trying to conform to my hypothesis, if you're trying to defeat it and the like. So questionnaires are obtrusive and reactive. And so the major new quantitative development in psychology and in positive psychology is the lexical analysis of big data. So this gives us a very sophisticated way of measuring in the social media, in speeches, in Twitter and Facebook, states like depression, pessimism, well-being, good relationships, and meaning. So just to summarize that, positive psychology and psychology generally is a very sophisticated quantitative science. The place of qualitative studies is to give us initial intuitions about what's going on. And just to give you an example of the difference between qualitative and quantitative, I've just finished a study with Philip Myman of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, in the old days, what we would have done, so this is looking at human agency versus God's agency in the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the old days, what we would have done is pick out passages that qualitatively talk about human agency and God's agency. But what Philip and I did was to analyze every word in the New Testament and Old Testament for human and divine agency words, to look at changes over time. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of words in this case. And what we basically found were huge effects quantitatively, that the Old Testament, that is the 5 books of Moses, are highly divine agency and obedience to God. The New Old Testament, that is the Old Testament that's about the prophets and the kings and the Babylonian exile, much more humanly agentic. And then the New Testament is much more humanly agentic than the Old Testament. So, Turek, that's just one example of a very sophisticated quantitative analysis of a huge database looking at human agency over history, over religion.
Thank you so much for your answer. It was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, Ceren Aydın.
Hi, and thank you for this opportunity. Martin, this is a specific question about your life, because one day we took a positive psychology class. I saw your name and I think that that's a dream. He is alive, but I can never talk with him. And that's a specific moment for me and very excited this moment. And I want to learn about your life, because we talk with you face to face. And one day I want to talk my students. I meet with, and he give us his specific lives. One small thing, I don't know, maybe no one or nowhere you didn't talk about.
Serena, I understand that you would like to know more things about my life, but I didn't understand which aspects you wanted me to talk about.
One specific information about your life. That's my favorite things. That's my favorite habits, or that's my favorite quotation in my life. Interesting, and yani, that's different moment. You are here and we are here. You talk with.
Well, the 3 main aspects of my life are first my work. So positive psychology is my first love in many ways, and I'm in flow when I do it. I'm in flow when I talk with you about it. The second is my family, my wife and 7 children, and my 3 dogs and my 4 grandchildren. And then the other aspect of my life, which is huge, is I'm a very serious international bridge player. By the way, Turkey is one of the great nations of the world in bridge, and many of my partners and opponents come from Turkey. And in fact, when this is done, I'll be playing in a tournament with and against Turkish international bridge players. So that's the third aspect of my life. I'm not all that good a bridge player, but the 3 aspects that occupy most of my life are, first, the work that you're seeing part of, second, my family, and third, international bridge. I don't know. Does that help, or is there something else you want to ask about?
I think Jaren had connection. Okay. Okay, we can move to next question then.
Just go back to Serene. I'm not sure I have answered her question.
Jaren, did you get the answer for your question, or?
Yes, that's good, because you say about something, your life, your family, your things. Thank you so much.
Well, one more thing, Serene. I think at age 78, what's most on my mind these days is my legacy and what will happen in the world in positive psychology after I'm gone. And so what I'm doing right now, that is talking to young Turkish students about their future, is very much legacy oriented.
Okay. This question about one of the kind of criticism about the positive psychology, again, that positive psychology kind of ignores the suffering. And the question says, how would you ever chasing happiness affect a person's well-being? Is our ultimate goal to be happy? Isn't it okay to not to be okay? I believe people need to experience loss and grief and trauma and so, then try some ways to grow out of adversity. I asked this question based on my review on the books such as Resilient Grieving and all those things.
There are many aspects to the question about my view of suffering. So first, positive psychology emerged from work on suffering, and that is, I spent the first 35 years of my career working on misery, depression, suicide, panic, drug abuse, divorce, and the like. And I'm all for negative emotions and taking them into account. So negative emotions have evolved for very important reasons, and we must take them seriously. So when we're sad, that is a signal to us from evolution that loss is around and looming. When we're anxious, that is a signal that danger is around. And when we're angry, that is a signal of injustice and trespass. So I'm not remotely interested in eliminating the negative emotions and eliminating suffering. Suffering is here to stay, and it's for good evolutionary reason. But often suffering gets out of hand, and sadness, anxiety, and anger dominate your life and make you dysfunctional. And that's what clinical psychology is about. I am a clinical psychologist. I'm all for doing clinical psychology. But clinical psychology has its limits. First, I've written 5 editions of a normal psychology textbook. And every 5 years, I reviewed the pharmacology and psychotherapy of all the major mental illnesses. And essentially, there has been very little progress in the last 30 years in clinical psychology. Basically, clinical psychology has reached what I call a 60% barrier, that various ways of measuring its effectiveness, but basically the drugs and psychotherapies for the major mental illnesses, when they work about 60% of the time, very often against a 40% placebo rate. That meant to me we needed to do better than that. And how could we do better with suffering? Well, positive psychology, the building of meaning, of purpose, of positive emotion, of engagement, of good relationships, is not a cure for suffering, but it buffers against suffering. And so it's very important to me that we use positive psychology, and there now is a field called positive psychiatry, to buffer against the major mental illnesses. Adversity is a natural state of life. I'm not against adversity, not at all. It's very often how we grow. And adversity very often engenders negative emotion. But very importantly, resilience from adversity is a part of what positive psychology is about. So that's a long-winded way of saying I take suffering and misery very seriously. I work on it. Positive psychology takes it seriously. And what positive psychology at its best can do is buffer against some of the most dysfunctional aspects of the major mental illnesses.
Thank you. David, we can have your question now.
Thank you. Pleasure to meet you, Professor Seligman.
Thank you, David.
I just had a quick question about the Hope Circuit, really. What a great book, by the way. And I don't really want to be a spoiler if no one's read it, so I just want to ask a specific question. I think it showed sort of real humility to sort of admit that you'd changed your mind, by the way, after a lifetime spent researching one thing. I think that was, I really got that. And I was just wondering a bit more about finding that out. What do you think its implications might be moving forward for positive psychology?
So, David, I didn't quite understand which aspect of my finding out that I was wrong about learned helplessness and changing my mind.
The Hope Circuit bit.
Well, the implications of Mayer's finding literally on the Hope Circuit, remember, just to remind people what it is, it's that there are two structures in the rodent brain, the dorsal-raphe nucleus, which is necessary and sufficient for helplessness, and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex circuit, which is necessary and sufficient for mastery and for breaking up helplessness. Its implications are very surprising, and that is, this means to me that sometime in the next 10 years, depression may become the second major mental illness that's curable. It's important to know that all of our drugs and all of our psychotherapies for depression and for helplessness are cosmetic. They change the symptoms, but they don't change the underlying structure. Mayer may have gotten a hold of the circuits that actually are necessary and sufficient for producing helplessness and helplessness depressions and for breaking them up. So one of my hopes is that in the next 10 years, people who work on transmagnetic stimulation and optogenetic stimulation will get fine enough resolution to be able to directly intervene in human dorsal-raphe nucleus and in the Hope Circuit itself to cure helplessness depressions. So that's my specific hope for the future about the work on the Hope Circuit. David, did that answer your question? I wasn't quite sure what you were asking.
Yeah, sorry, it was I was so excited to speak to you. That's what it was. I was so sort of. I was more interested in whether it would have an implication in, positive psychology as a whole, rather than the sort of curative nature. Whether it would change anything or any views within that.
Tell me more, David. I'm still not understanding.
Okay, so in the book you talk about that it has, it potentially could have an impact on therapy, as an example, and that it might question some of the therapeutic methods and their efficacy.
Yeah.
I'm a second year MAP student in the UK. After reading your book, that sort of motivated me to actually participate in that. So I'm more interested in, has that got, rather than the therapy side, has it got an implication for positive psychologists?
Right. So on the therapy side, that's the reason that Rashid and I wrote Positive Psychotherapy. So we believe that therapy should not end with the alleviation of sadness, anxiety, and anger, but rather you want to teach people the skills of PERMA as well. So people do want to be happy. They want more than just not being miserable. And what positive psychology does with positive psychotherapy, it teaches the skills of well-being, which buffers against pathology, but also builds PERMA as well. So that's the implication, David, for therapy. Now, tell me again about the second part, about being a math UK person, and I didn't understand that.
So I was just thinking whether it had an implication for positive psychology as a discipline, really. Whether it I can understand its consequences. You've explained them clearly within the therapy environment, but has it got any consequences in relation to positive psychology practice environment?
Well, I think positive psychology has become a discipline. It's not just a subdiscipline of psychology, however. It's a subdiscipline of neuroscience. It's a subdiscipline of sociology. And very importantly, there's a movement called the positive humanities, which ask the question in literature and in history, what can we learn not just from all the mistakes that we made, from tragedy, what can we learn about the positive institutions, about human freedom, about strong families, about a literature which is about virtue and nobility. So positive psychology, I think of, has become a discipline which is roughly like well-being and positive studies, which bears on many aspects of academia and of practice as well.
Thank you.
Okay, Melis Acar.
Hi, Mr. Seligman. I hope that you are doing fine during hard COVID-19 times. So I am Melis from Turkey. I am an industrial and organizational psychologist in Turkey, and I am working as an HR specialist in a multinational company. So my question is that I am currently interested in still organizational behavior, and I got a chance to take some positive psychology courses, and I realized that resilience is becoming more popular and important competency, especially in organizations. So my question is that is there any advice that you may share with us how people increase their resilience capacity? This is my question. Thank you very much.
Good question, Melis. I have a few things to say about it. First, I'm quite interested in productivity in the workplace, and there is a clear relationship between PERMA and well-being and productivity. That is, the happier workers are, the higher their well-being, the better relationships, the more productive they are. So that's where I begin. We have a remarkable study coming out on 1 million soldiers in the United States Army. So I was fortunate enough to, with General Rhonda Cornum, to being custodian of longitudinal studies of the American Army. And in this study, we measured, when 1 million soldiers entered the Army, we measured positive affectivity and optimism and negative affectivity. And then we looked over the next 5 years at winning awards. So 12% of the Army in 5 years wins work awards. These are awards for exemplary performance at work and also for heroism. And what we found very strongly was that men and women at the outset of their Army career who were high in positive affectivity and low in negative affectivity and high in optimism were much more likely to win awards at work and for heroism. So the first implication of that is hire happy people. Hire happy people. They're going to do better. The second implication is we know good interventions for resilience and for making people happier at work. And those are essentially the positive interventions that we discussed. And so the second implication was for your workforce, for HR people, measure PERMA and use the well-established interventions to build it. So resilience typically means coming back from bad events, and indeed COVID is one of those things. So I'm very interested in resilience interventions that will move people from stagnation to flourishing post-COVID. But also the message is, in general, hire happy people to start with.
Thank you very much. So it might be helpful for us, therefore, sometimes, actually, generally, we use personal inventory to measure their capabilities, strengths, and the candidates' development areas. But especially in young generation, they do not prefer to being patient to learn how corporate or how organization works properly. But I took my notes, so thank you very much.
I didn't understand what you were asking in the second part, Melis.
Actually, it wasn't a question, it's just a comment that I try to explain that, especially in young generation, the Y generation, I guess, they do not prefer to wait or being patient to engage the organization. It depends on the Turkey's current financial, socio-financial circumstances. But I totally agree with you. We would like to attract more positive people to increase productivity in organizations. So thank you very much.
Yes, I understand it now, and I want to endorse what you're saying. So one of the reasons I'm especially interested in talking to young students is you are the future. And those among you who are efficacious and optimistic and imaginative are truly the future, not only of Turkish corporations, but of Turkey and the world.
Okay, thank you. As we are moving into last 10 minutes, I will get one more question, and then we have another COVID-related question, and then we will end the session, because now last 10 minutes. Burçin?
Hello, I'm Burçin. This is a really honor to meet you, Mr. Seligman. I have been teaching positive psychology in different universities in Turkey, and you asked in your discussion of one of the questions whether any interventions had been applied in Turkey. Yes, indeed, and I was in one of those teams led by Professor Çiğdem Kağıtçıbaşı. We did an intervention program for young people, young adolescents, and we tried to teach them some positive abilities like self-efficacy, future-orientedness, optimism, and hope. And it worked really well, and I hope it's going to be implemented again in the near future in different secondary and high schools. So what I have learned in positive psychology so far had really helped me, especially during this COVID period, that at least I know how to learn my character strengths and resilience. But what we talked so far is about interventions which are implemented by institutions. Like when we say positive education, it's implemented in schools. When it is positive leadership, positive communication, it's again implemented in organizations. So taken all these knowledge that we had so far from positive psychology, how can we make all these valuable knowledge available to lay people, to more disadvantaged people, and to groups in society overall? Have you known about any interventions that make all these positive psychology knowledge available and valid for public?
Very importantly, all the basic tools of positive psychology are free. So the measurements of permanent well-being on my website are free. The interventions are public knowledge. We've written about all of them. You can find them in Positive Psychotherapy and other books. So people in schools, in corporations, in coaching, in parenting can use these. So there's no central organization that controls them. So they're out there and they're free in public use. Most importantly is that people know about these things. And that's why at the beginning I said that politics is very important. It's important that people know that they can be happier, that they can have higher well-being, that they can have more meaning in life. And that's very much a political and public relations endeavor. I'm not sure I've answered your question, though, so let me see if you want to expand on that before we
so
conclude.
maybe one thing that you can expand this topic on, the cultural sensitivity, like all these measures that are available right now had been developed in the Western side of the world. And for instance, taking Turkey into consideration, we are a very collectivistic culture. And for instance, let's take the example of career calling. We didn't even have a word for it because it has some religious root, had been in the it has been developed in the Western side of the world. So, or when we say happiness, maybe we can talk about something like collective happiness, because when you ask a Turkish person, how are you? The answer is more in the sense of we are all fine. So the person doesn't say, I am fine, but we are fine, it's okay. So there is more collectivistic side of all these concepts that we learn in positive psychology. So maybe that cultural dimension might be important when we are taking all this knowledge and trickling it down to public.
Yeah, so it's very important to modify measures and interventions to the culture. The popularity of positive psychology in China has partly to do with adapting the interventions and the measures to a more collectivist culture. And so, again, these measures are for the most part, are Western in their origin, but they're free and you can adapt them to the Turkish environment, and you can test, most importantly, whether or not they work. I think they're highly adaptable both to collectivist cultures, India, China, Japan, all of which have used them, as well as highly individualistic Western cultures. but it's your job. Take them and adapt them.
Yes, exactly. And I have been involved in different research projects, and I'm also doing positive psychology coaching. So I'm doing my best to teach my clients and my students. Yeah, thank you very much.
Do email me about what aspects of the interventions and the measurements need to be changed to for Turkish culture.
Yes, for sure. I already prepared my draft email for you when you gave your email address. So yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, seligman@upenn.edu.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we are 1 minute over our scheduled time, but there is only one last question that I really would like to ask. So what would positive psychology tell us how to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic process?
Yes, it's a good thing to conclude with. We can only make a couple of guesses about the science. So there is a positive psychology of infectious illness, and with quite a surprising result. So this is the question: if you're isolating during COVID, what does positive psychology tell you about what you should be doing? And the answer is, have as much fun as you possibly can under these difficult circumstances. Let me tell you the science underneath that. So Sheldon Cohn, about 15 years ago, injected rhinovirus, which is a coronavirus, into the nose of 300 volunteers and then isolated them and asked if he could predict who was going to get the infection, who would get colds. And he had measured optimism, positive emotion, negative emotions before, and incidentally, he weighed the mucus. So this is a good, rigorous study of rhinovirus. And he basically found that optimism and pessimism had no effect on who gets a cold. What did matter was positive affectivity. So people who were happy, merry, cheerful, which is not the same thing as optimistic, which is a cognitive state, were less likely to come down with severe colds. So part one, the little we know about what to do when you're in quarantine, as I am, is to have as much positive emotion as you possibly can. Dance, have sex, eat, we bought a puppy, and the like. Then the second question is, when COVID is over, what's going to predict how well you're going to do? And there the answer is resilience. People who are hopeful, who are optimistic about the future, as opposed to people who are merry and cheerful, they're different states, are the people who recover most rapidly and become productive. And in this regard, Ibrahim, here's the last thing I want to say to this wonderful group that I've had the pleasure of getting to know a bit about the future and about COVID. There are essentially two dominant intellectual views of what post-COVID like will be like. The first one was, I'll call it the Yeats view, was written by the poet Yeats, Irish poet Yeats, 100 years ago. And it asks the question about what rough beast is slouching its way to Bethlehem to be born. Now, in the world, the view that the world is in labor now and that something new will come out of COVID, the Yeats view is pessimistic. It's the rough beast slouching its way to Bethlehem to be born. That's not what I believe. I'm most persuaded by Joanna of Norwich. Joanna was a monk in the 1360s in Norwich, writing about the Black Plague. Black Plague, as all of you know, is much worse than COVID. no safety net, 1/3 of people dying, not 2% of people, but 1/3 of people dying. And here's what Joanna said in 1365. He said not, thou shalt not be travailed. He said not, thou shalt not be tempesteth. He said not, thou shalt not be diseased. He said, thou shalt not be overcome, and all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well.
Thank you for your great answer for the last question. First of all, I would like to thank everyone who have patiently asked questions and listened to all session and stayed here. We also had around more than 200 people on YouTube too, so simultaneously streamed on YouTube. So Dr. Seligman, thank you for your time and for your insights and answers for all the questions. We are really happy to host you, with Turkish students and academics in Turkey. So we wish you, great days ahead, and then hopefully we will overcome this pandemic process positively, and then maybe we can meet face to face afterwards. Thank you again for being here.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for the honor.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot again.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Seligman.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
We are also getting great kind of responses on YouTube too, and everyone is thanking and everyone is happy, for seeing you and listening to you in person. So they're also saying their heartful thanks to you for your insights.
You're welcome. Let's do it again a year from now.
Sure.
It would be
Be great. And of course, I think we shouldn't pass without saying thank you to PsychOz. They have been patiently communicating with Dr. Seligman and organizing the whole event. They emailed, I don't know how many times, back and forth, and organized whole thing. They did registration part and emailed everyone one by one. So thank you guys for organizing this great event.